Picture this. It's the 9th century in China, and a group of Taoist alchemists are hunched over a small furnace, stirring a mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter. They're not trying to build a weapon, they're trying to live forever. Yeah, you heard that right. The gun, the thing that would go on to end more human lives than almost any invention in history, was born out of a search for the elixir of immortality. And instead of eternal life, these guys got themselves a face full of fire. Somewhere in a smoky lab, something ignited. Something exploded. And something in human history quietly, irreversibly shifted. Nobody in that room knew it yet, but they had just lit the fuse, literally, on one of the most consequential technological revolutions our species would ever produce. So, how did we go from, oops, my immortality potion just caught fire, to intercontinental ballistic missiles and pocket-sized handguns? That's what we're unpacking today. And I promise you, the road from black powder to modern firearms is stranger, slower, and way more chaotic than you'd expect. There's no single eureka moment, no light bulb over anyone's head. It's centuries of trial, error, explosions, stolen ideas, wars, and a whole lot of guys just trying not to die while testing stuff that really wanted to kill them. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand guns, you first have to understand gunpowder. And to understand gunpowder, you have to understand that ancient Chinese alchemy was basically one long, unregulated chemistry experiment with a body count. Back before gunpowder, Chinese alchemists were obsessed with finding substances that could grant eternal life. This wasn't some fringe hobby either. Emperors were funding this stuff. If you were a talented alchemist, you had actual state backing to mix chemicals and see what happened. Naturally, this led to some very bad ideas, like emperors drinking mercury because they thought it would make them immortal. Spoiler, it did not. It made them very, very dead. But amid all this reckless experimentation, someone stumbled onto a formula. About 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. Mix those together the right way, and you don't get eternal life. You get a compound that burns fast, hot, and violently. Congratulations, you've just invented gunpowder, and also possibly ruined your eyebrows. The earliest written reference we have to this stuff comes from a Taoist text warning alchemists not to mix these particular ingredients together, because doing so had literally burned down buildings and singed people's hands and faces. Which, if you think about it, is one of the funniest safety warnings in history. It's basically an ancient version of a warning label that says, do not combine these things unless you want your lab to become a crater. And of course, because humans are humans, that warning probably made more people want to try it, not fewer. Now here's the thing. Gunpowder wasn't invented as a weapon. Not even close. For decades, maybe even a century or more, the Chinese primarily used this explosive discovery for fireworks and ceremonial purposes. Think about that for a second. The single most destructive chemical compound in early human history was first used to celebrate festivals and scare away evil spirits with pretty colored explosions in the sky. It's almost poetic. Also deeply ironic, considering where this was all headed. But you can't keep something that explodes locked away in the fun and festive category forever. Someone, somewhere, eventually looked at gunpowder and thought, hey, what if I pointed this at my enemies instead of the sky? And that's exactly what happened. By the 10th century, Chinese military engineers started incorporating gunpowder into warfare. The first applications were pretty crude. We're talking about gunpowder-filled arrows, essentially turning regular archery into a fiery nightmare. Imagine you're a soldier on a medieval Chinese battlefield, and suddenly the arrows raining down on you are not just sharp sticks, but sharp sticks that are also on fire and occasionally just detonate. Bad day at the office, to say the least. Then things escalated. Chinese engineers developed something called the fire lance. Now, this thing is basically the missing link between a spear and a gun, and honestly, it's one of the coolest and most underrated inventions in military history. A fire lance was essentially a tube, often made of bamboo, packed with gunpowder and attached to the end of a spear. When ignited, it would shoot out flames, sparks, and sometimes shrapnel like broken pottery or metal scraps directly at the enemy. It wasn't precise. It wasn't reloadable in any modern sense. But it was terrifying. And terrifying counts for a lot on a battlefield. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Over time, soldiers realized that if you packed the tube tighter and added actual projectiles, pellets, rocks, bits of metal, the fire lance could launch them outward with serious force. This is the exact moment where the concept of a gun, as we understand it, starts to take shape. You've got a tube, an explosive propellant, and a projectile. That's it. That's the fundamental architecture of every firearm that would ever be built after this point, from muskets to sniper rifles. Everything downstream of this moment is basically refinement. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Chinese had developed what historians call the hand cannon, sometimes referred to as a handgun, if you want to sound extra medieval about it. This was a metal or bronze tube, closed at one end except for a small hole mounted on a wooden stock or pole. You'd pack gunpowder down the barrel, add a projectile, and then touch a flame to the small hole to ignite the charge. The explosion would launch the projectile out the open end with enough force to seriously injure or kill someone. This is, structurally speaking, the first true gun in human history. It's clunky, it's slow, it's honestly kind of a pain to use, but it works, and once something like this exists, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Now, you might be thinking, okay, cool, so China invented guns, end of story. But no, this is where the story actually gets going, because inventions rarely stay contained to one place, especially when they're this useful for killing people efficiently. Ideas travel. And in the 13th century, there was one force on the planet doing more traveling and more conquering than literally anyone else: the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and his successors, ended up being the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And as the Mongols swept across Asia, they came into contact with Chinese military technology, including gunpowder weapons. Being the extremely pragmatic conquerors that they were, the Mongols didn't just steal the tech, they absorbed it, improved on it in some cases, and carried it westward as they expanded their empire into the Middle East and toward Europe. Gunpowder essentially hitched a ride on horseback across the entire Eurasian landmass, courtesy of one of the most effective military machines the world has ever seen. By the time gunpowder technology reached the Islamic world, cultures there began experimenting and innovating with it as well. Historical records suggest that gunpowder weapons show up in the Middle East by the late 13th century, and from there, it wasn't long before Europe got its hands on the formula too, likely through a combination of trade routes, warfare, and probably more than a little bit of good old-fashioned industrial espionage. Because let's be honest, if your neighboring civilization has a weapon that can explode, you are absolutely going to try to figure out how it works, one way or another. Once gunpowder hit Europe sometime in the early 14th century, things moved fast. Well, fast by medieval standards, which still meant decades, but bear with me. European metallurgists and engineers, already skilled in casting bronze and iron for bells and other large objects, adapted those skills toward casting cannons. And this is a crucial point because Europe's real contribution to firearms technology wasn't necessarily inventing gunpowder or the concept of a gun. That credit firmly belongs to China. Europe's genius, if you can call it that, was industrializing and scaling up the technology at an absolutely relentless pace. European cannons started as massive, unwieldy siege weapons. Early cannons were enormous, sometimes requiring dozens of men and animals just to transport them. But they were undeniably effective at one very specific job: knocking down castle walls that had stood as symbols of impenetrable power for centuries. Think about that for a second. Castles had been the ultimate defensive structure for hundreds of years: thick stone walls, high towers, moats, an entire architectural philosophy built around the idea that if you make your walls thick enough, nobody can get through. And then gunpowder shows up and just says, actually, we can. The famous Siege of Constantinople in 1453 is a brutal, historic example of this shift. The Ottoman Empire used massive cannons, including one absolute unit of a weapon called the basilica, to blast through walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years. 1,000 years of defensive dominance, undone in weeks by gunpowder artillery. If that's not a mic drop moment in military history, I don't know what is. By the way, If you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. But here's the thing. Massive siege cannons are great for knocking down walls, but they're not exactly practical for a single soldier to carry around and use in open combat. So while cannon technology was scaling up in size, there was a parallel track of innovation happening to scale things down. Engineers and gunsmiths across Europe started asking, can we make a smaller version of this? Something one person could carry, aim, and fire without needing an entire team and a wagon? The answer was yes, and it came in the form of the handgun. Essentially Europe's own take on that earlier Chinese hand cannon. These were still incredibly primitive by modern standards. You'd have a simple metal tube attached to a wooden stock, and to fire it, you needed to physically touch a burning wick or hot iron to a small touch hole to ignite the powder inside. This required, and I cannot stress this enough, an insane amount of coordination. You're holding a heavy metal tube in one hand, trying to aim it at a moving target, while also holding a lit match or hot rod in your other hand to actually fire the thing. It's basically the medieval equivalent of trying to rub your stomach and pat your head, except if you mess up, you might blow your own hand off. Naturally, this problem needed solving, and that's where the matchlock mechanism comes in. Arguably one of the most important innovations in the entire history of firearms. The matchlock, which emerged in Europe around the mid-15th century, introduced a mechanical arm called a serpentine that held a burning slow match. When you pulled a lever or trigger, the serpentine would swing down and touch the burning match to the touch hole, igniting the powder. This might sound like a small change, but it was revolutionary because for the first time, a soldier could hold their firearm with both hands, aim more steadily, and fire with something resembling precision, all without needing a second hand free to manually apply fire. This is also, by the way, the origin point of an entire vocabulary we still use today. Ever heard the phrase going off half-cocked? That comes directly from matchlock and later flintlock mechanisms, where the firing hammer had a half-cock safety position. Language absorbs technology in weird, sneaky ways like that, and firearms have left fingerprints all over modern English that most people don't even realize. Matchlock weapons spread like wildfire, pun very much intended, across European armies throughout the late 15th and 16th centuries. Suddenly you didn't need decades of training to become a lethal soldier. Sure, matchlock guns were slow to reload, inaccurate at range, and completely useless in rain because, shocking twist, wet gunpowder and burning matches do not mix well. But they didn't need the years of physical training that, say, mastering a longbow required. A peasant with minimal training could be handed a matchlock, taught the basic loading and firing sequence, and turned into a functional soldier within weeks. This absolutely terrified the traditional warrior aristocracy of Europe, and for good reason. For centuries, warfare had been dominated by knights, heavily armored, highly trained, and extremely expensive to produce. Becoming a knight required years, sometimes a lifetime, of training and resources that only the wealthy could afford. Knights represented not just military power, but social and political power. An entire class structure built around the idea that elite warriors were simply superior on the battlefield. Guns obliterated that entire premise. Suddenly, a peasant conscript with a matchlock could kill an armored knight from a distance without needing years of training, without needing generational wealth, without needing to be born into the right family. Armor, which had been evolving for centuries to counter swords, arrows, and blunt weapons, simply could not keep pace with the penetrating power of gunpowder projectiles. This wasn't just a military revolution, it was a social one. Guns democratized lethal force in a way nothing had before, and that shift rippled through European society for generations. Of course, the matchlock had glaring flaws, and inventors kept tinkering. Enter the wheel lock mechanism, developed in the early 16th century, likely in the German states or Italy, depending on which historian you ask. The wheel lock used a spring-loaded steel wheel that spun against a piece of pyrite to generate sparks, sort of like a mechanical lighter you'd find on an old-school Zippo. This meant you didn't need a constantly burning match anymore, which was a massive upgrade in terms of convenience and, frankly, safety. Unfortunately, wheel locks were mechanically complex and expensive to produce, which meant they were mostly limited to wealthy nobles, cavalry officers, and people who really wanted a fancy pistol to show off at parties. Not exactly a mass market solution. That solution came with the flintlock mechanism, which emerged around the early 17th century, primarily credited to French gunsmiths. The flintlock used a piece of flint held in a hammer, or cock, that would strike against a steel plate called the frizzen when the trigger was pulled, generating sparks that ignited the priming powder. This design was simpler, cheaper, more reliable, and much more weather-resistant than earlier mechanisms. It quickly became the dominant firearm technology across the globe for roughly 2 centuries. If you picture a classic pirate era or Revolutionary War era musket or pistol, that's almost certainly a flintlock. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was the mechanism that armed entire nations, entire revolutions, entire eras of human history. Now, while all this mechanical innovation was happening in the ignition systems, gun barrels themselves were also evolving. Early guns were smoothbore, meaning the inside of the barrel was completely smooth, which is simple to manufacture but pretty inaccurate over any real distance, since the projectile could tumble unpredictably as it left the barrel. Gunsmiths eventually discovered that cutting spiral grooves into the inside of a barrel, a process called rifling, would cause the projectile to spin as it exited, dramatically improving accuracy and range through basic gyroscopic stability. Rifled barrels existed as early as the 15th and 16th centuries in some experimental forms, but they were slow and expensive to manufacture by hand, which limited their widespread military adoption for a long time. It wasn't until manufacturing techniques improved centuries later that rifled barrels became standard issue rather than a luxury. By the 19th century, firearm technology exploded, again, pun fully intended, into a period of rapid, almost dizzying innovation. Percussion cap ignition systems replaced flintlocks, using a small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive explosive compound that would ignite when struck by the hammer, making firearms more reliable in wet conditions and faster to fire. Then came breech-loading designs, which allowed soldiers to load ammunition from the back of the barrel instead of ramming powder and shot down the muzzle, drastically increasing the rate of fire. Then came self-contained cartridges, combining the bullet, powder, and primer into a single metal casing, essentially the format that modern ammunition still uses today. And then, of course, came repeating and automatic firing mechanisms, culminating eventually in fully automatic weapons capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. Think about the sheer scale of that transformation. We went from Chinese alchemists accidentally discovering an explosive compound while trying to concoct immortality potions, to bamboo fire lances strapped to spears, to bronze hand cannons requiring a second person just to light them, to matchlocks, wheel locks, flintlocks, percussion caps, and eventually machine guns, all within roughly 1,000 years. And when you consider that humans had been using essentially the same basic weapon technology, spears, bows, swords, for tens of thousands of years before that, the speed of firearm evolution once it got going is genuinely staggering. What's wild to me, honestly, is how much of this technological revolution was driven not by some grand unified plan, but by countless individual people across different continents and centuries, each one trying to solve one small, specific, immediate problem. The alchemists weren't trying to invent a weapon at all. The people adding shrapnel to fire lances just wanted their flame weapon to hurt more. The person who invented the matchlock mechanism just wanted soldiers to be able to aim with both hands. Nobody sat down one day and said, "Let's design the modern firearm." It emerged piece by piece, problem by problem, explosion by explosion, out of human ingenuity colliding with human violence over and over again across 1,000 years and half the planet. And that, weirdly, might be the most human part of this entire story. We didn't set out to build guns. We stumbled into gunpowder while chasing immortality, and then spent the next several centuries refining and re-refining that discovery, driven by war, ambition, fear, and the endless human impulse to solve the next small problem in front of us without ever fully reckoning with where the bigger picture was heading. From a smoky alchemist's lab in Tang Dynasty China to the muskets that shaped revolutions and empires, the gun's origin story isn't really about any one genius inventor. It's about centuries of accumulated trial and error, borrowed ideas, conquest, and refinement, passed hand to hand across cultures that often didn't even like each other very much. So the next time you see a firearm in a movie, a museum, or a video game, remember it's not really the product of one moment of brilliance. It's the end result of a thousand-year relay race that started with someone trying to live forever and ended with the most efficient tool for ending life that humanity has ever built. Kind of ironic when you think about it that way, isn't it?